not long to go now until our fate is decided in the Premier League as we take on Bournemouth on Sunday at Goodison. Aside from all that, the recent news we've seen lately has been potential investment at Everton by a couple of interested parties. Joining me now to talk once again financially about the club is the senior correspondent from Off the Pitch, James Corbett. First of all, James, things have moved on since we spoke last about the financial issues at Everton, with the issues that could come about financially and potential problems with the Premier League and things like that. Now we're looking at what's certainly been discussed and much further down the line than rumours that there are a couple of companies looking to invest, and at what extent we'll go to in a second. And the latest one that come on in the past week was a company called MSP, who have entered a period of exclusivity with Moshiri. First of all, for those of us without financial knowledge like yourself, what does that mean? And essentially, what would they have been doing since they've been given that process?
Okay, well, the period of exclusivity sort of means that the club will open their books up to MSP. They'll do a period of due diligence. They'll get their accountants and their consultants in, and then they'll close the deal. Hopefully, if that's what they want to do, they will have agreed a heads of terms which will outline what the deal will look like. There's been quite a lot of speculation on the nature of the deal. One suggestion is that they will effectively loan the club money to complete the stadium project, which will then be converted into shares, and there will be further transfers of cash over subsequent years, which leads to them getting a full majority stake in the club, and presumably an exit for Mr. Moshiri. But I must emphasise that's only speculation. Nobody at the club has spoken about it, and they're not really empowered to do so. MSP haven't done any media, and Mr. Moshiri's representatives have sort of given outlines to various members of the media, but that's about it. I mean, what you've read in the Athletic or the Guardian or whatever is pretty much all that's in the public sphere at the moment.
Mm. Now, with them as a company, what knowledge do you have? What knowledge have we been given about them? A group from New York is basically, as much as I've read, they've had real success with various sport entities as well. Naturally, when we ever get linked with new ownership, especially given what's happened since Moshiri came in 2016, has been really positive. The thing I keep saying to people and having arguments about is that there's every reason to be cautious about any takeover, regardless of who the people are that want to come in and invest. Is it fair to take that level of cautiousness, particularly with this sort of company?
I think you've always got to be careful what you wish for, especially since they don't have an especially established track record in football. What they do have, though, is significant experience in US-style sports marketing. The co-founder is or was a very significant agent in American sports in the 1990s. The fictional film character Jerry Maguire was meant to be based around him,
Right.
and he's since gone into the investment side of things. I mean, they have a stake in McLaren Formula One, and McLaren, well, less so McLaren, but Formula One is one of the big sports business success stories over the last 5 or 6 years, in terms of expanding its reach and tapping into new demographics and so on. So you'd like to think that they might bring or utilise some of that experience, and McLaren Formula One is a blue chip brand, and to be part of that investment stable, I suppose on one level is quite exciting. On another level, these are people without connections to football, to our great city, to our great football club. So I think there's got to be a degree of caution. But if they buy into Everton, not just financially but also emotionally, then let's hope for the best because
Yeah.
let's be honest, we have an owner who's certainly put his money in, but doesn't doesn't have that connection with
Yeah.
either
Yeah.
with either the club, the fans, or the city, despite his best intentions, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's fair to say that, as much as people would hate to say it and admit it. The other group have been interested as well. Have discussed, but obviously I don't think they're as far along the lines of MSP, and that's Miami based 777. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I know quite a bit more about them, and I've spoken to them quite regularly over the last 2.5 years. They've bought a chain of football clubs. It's known in the industry as multi-club ownership, or MCOs. So they had they retain a small shareholding in Sevilla, and over the last 2.5 years or so, they've bought Genoa in Italy. They've just been promoted to Serie A, albeit they were previously relegated under 777's
Yeah.
ownership. They bought Hertha Berlin, they bought Paris FC, they bought Vasco da Gama in Brazil. And I mean, how would you describe them? I mean, they're an investment fund, and I suppose there's no transparency on who's putting money into the investment fund, but it is a series of high net worth individuals, and they might be putting $5 million in, or $10 million in, or $100 million in. We don't know, but they've empowered this fund to go around the world and build up this network of clubs. They recently appointed a guy called Don Dransfeld as their head of football operations, and I mean, I'd be surprised if any of your listeners had heard of him. But Don was responsible for essentially putting together what is now City Football Group, so the group of 13 or 14 clubs that are associated with Manchester City, and
Well,
acquiring those clubs. And I mean, the idea underlying MCOs is that you can share certain cost benefits. You can centralize parts of the administration and the scouting network, and you can trade players between clubs and so on. And it's certainly the way that the game is heading. I mean, it poses a few governance issues that kind of need to be addressed by FIFA and UEFA. But the fact of the matter is that there's been huge activity in the football M&A market, so to speak, since the pandemic. There's a lot of cash in private equity at the moment, and American investment companies in particular see a lot of value in um, English football, particularly Premier League football. On the other hand, I mean, I spoke to Andres Velasquez, who's 777's MD. I interviewed him about 15 months ago. And he said that they were sort of considering England, but they said that it was very, very expensive. And, at the time, their focus was, I think he said it was on Eastern Europe, Central Europe. So it's kind of surprising that they're looking at investment that could be 700 or 800 million pounds by the time everything's taken into account. But anyway, they don't have the exclusivity that MSP do, so we'll wait and see. And I rather suspect more will come out quite quickly, depending on Sunday's result against Bournemouth and which division Everton are playing in next season.
I suppose in layman terms, most certainly of our listeners would be like, well, in how quickly can all this happen? Because I know when we arranged to have a chat about this, with in regard to MSP, you were saying about this week that you could see activity happening this week, um, with 777, which from what you said seems very different to the MSP style of investment. Would and Most fans would look at it and say, well, we need these people to come in and own the club in order to get rid of what we've got currently. With what you mentioned there about 777, am I right in thinking that these will be relatively smaller investments with not the view of actually taking over the club?
No, they've taken over complete shareholdings, or majority shareholdings. I think shareholding in
Right.
Hertha Berlin was 63%. I think they own Genoa outright. They own Vasco outright. They own Paris FC outright. I think it's only really Sevilla where it's a smaller shareholding. I mean, in terms of the time it takes to complete these deals, I would expect a lot of the groundwork and the research and the funding has already been done if there's an exclusivity deal in place. And if we remember when Mashiri came in, I mean, that took everybody completely by surprise.
Yeah.
There was speculation in the media running up to it that there was a guy called, was it John J. Moores, an
Yeah.
American investor who was then linked with Swansea, who was favourite to take over. And then Mashiri just came in and caught everybody blindsided. I mean, I'll always vividly remember it because I was in Zurich with all the other sort of sports news journalists covering a FIFA presidential election. And this news came out at like 10 or 11 o'clock at night. Nobody saw it coming. So, yeah, I mean, they could close this deal, and I would suspect that there's an imperative for them to do so because that stadium project is going to be swallowing up lots and lots of money over the next 12 months, and they need to complete their funding to do so.
What is the general question I've received most often from people who have said that we're having a chat again was what is the appeal of Everton, both generally and in particular from two groups like that. I mean, what you've said there about Ashiri and being the guy associated with Swansea, when you see that sort of thing rise and there's an initial company who are interested in this, is that the sort of thing that raises everybody's um, eyebrows around them and thinks, well, we need to have a piece of that. We should be looking at that as well because and follow suit from a group that has initially looked at it.
Well, I mean, Premier League football clubs in particular are especially attractive to investors. If you want to invest in an MLS club in the States, you're effectively looking at the same sort of price. If you go outside the top 6 or 7 teams in England, if you invest in a club in Carolina or whatever, you're literally looking at $500 billion minimum investment because you have to pay for the club license, you have to pay for the acquisition of the club. If it's a startup club in the States, you can probably double that because you have to have your own stadium as well, built to a certain standard. So if you're going to pick up a team in the richest league in the world and the most successful global football league in the world and the oldest football league in the world for the same price, then it's immediately attractive. And then you throw in the fact that Everton are 9 times league champions. They've got an amazing history. They've got an incredibly loyal fan base. They're going to have arguably the best stadium in the country within the next 15 months. Then it becomes very, very even more attractive. You know, you have all these doomsayers on social media and fan forums saying, who'd ever invest in Everton? Well, I suppose it might have been the case 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. And we all remember Bill Kenwright's sort of 12-year-long search for a new buyer, which culminated in Mashiri. But I think things are radically different now, and there is a significant global appetite for these sort of acquisitions. And when you see Bournemouth, for instance, being taken over by American owners, you look at that, you think, actually, what is the upside there? Because it's got a tiny stadium, doesn't have the prestige, doesn't have the fan base, doesn't have the track record in the Premier League. So if Bournemouth can go to Bill Foley, a billionaire who's also very successful in American sports, why wouldn't you consider Everton if you're in
Yeah.
that sector.
There's that the financial issues we've spoken about in regards to FFP, all of that kind of thing, the amount of money we're allowed to spend on players, and that sort of more football-esque discussions that every common fan would discuss and that's known. Um, I take it they don't see that as any sort of issue. Should they come in and I suppose secondary to that question, would, for instance, the summer transfer window, say if this was to happen straight up in the next couple of weeks and we go into a transfer window, would that change what ability Everton have to progress in that sort of thing?
No, it wouldn't. I mean, they obviously have to have the funds in place to underwrite transfer business, and it's been done at a loss. But the FFP calculations are there and there to stay, and I don't really see too much changing until we're in the new stadium. I mean, obviously, there's been some transfer business, and they're going to have to trade players, and maybe you'll see some weirder dealing at the edges. You sell Onana on the 30th of June, and suddenly it frees up 50 million quid to spend on the 1st of July, that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, you could have Mohammed bin Salman buying Everton, and realistically, with all his wealth and resources, he wouldn't be able to move the dial because those rules are in place, and we're stuck by them. I suppose in real terms, it's a risk consideration, isn't it? Because we do have a very poor squad at the moment and a very uneven squad, and it needs investment. So, assuming we do stay up, and hopefully we do stay up, the question mark remains: well, is that squad going to be enough to keep us up next season without that investment? And I'm sure they will look at what can be spent and what needs to be spent and factor that into any offer.
Well, the income of transfer money obviously allows us to spend, and I guess the other part of that as well is the commercial side. What you mentioned about MSP and the American style in which they have as a group, I suppose that would be appealing to a lot of Everton fans, thinking, well, they can come in, they can sort out our commercial deals, which most people look at as notoriously poor in the years gone by. Would that be something akin to them that would appeal to a lot of people?
Yeah, definitely. And if you look at the financials of Leeds United, for instance, I mean, their owner Andrea Redazzani has a background in broadcast and digital, and that's one of the big growth areas. But they've also partnered with the owners of the San Francisco 49ers, and they've helped a great deal. Leeds have got, in relation to their turnover, very, very impressive commercial income at the moment. So you'd like to think that MSP, if they came in, could lend that expertise. But I think you referred to the commercial performance as being very, very poor. I mean, that's an assumption that a lot of people make. But you can only deal with the tools that have been handed to you. Yeah. And in Everton's case, it was 28 years last Sunday since they last won a trophy. Goodison is not set up for large-scale corporate activity. They're not in Europe. They've not been in Europe for years. So, you can compare Everton to Liverpool or Man United or Man City all you like, but the fact of the matter is we're not in the Champions League. We don't win trophies. We don't have a nation state backing us, so we can't get those soft deals that like City and increasingly Newcastle are going to get. And we're left, I suppose, in the second or third tier of commercial offers, and that's going to be dubious crypto companies, dubious bookmakers, local businessmen made good. For instance, Christopher Ward, the jeweler they're tied up with, he's a big Everton fan, or the owner of that company is a big Everton fan, and a few other bits and pieces. I think the dial will move when they move into Bramley-Moore Dock and when they start achieving on the field again.
Um, the board side of things now, again, going back to what we spoke about a little bit earlier on in terms of people desperate for people absolutely desperate will find this out on Sunday um, after the game, and regardless of what situation we're going to be in following that game against Bournemouth, the boardroom side of things. Can you give us sort of a feeling towards what would happen? I guess as soon as that investment from MSP came in, would they look to make changes there? Would they obviously look to? I presume they want to add somebody to the board of their group as well.
Well, I think if I was going to invest hundreds of millions of pounds into Everton, the first thing I want to do is get rid of the chairman who's overseen the most unsuccessful period in Everton's entire history, and the longest trophyless streak. I mean, that is without without getting to the personality side of things, it's
Yeah,
totally inexplicable that Bill Kenwright is still chairman with 1% or 1.4% shareholding in the club. I don't understand that. Um, nice enough fellow that he is, he's a 77-year-old theatre impresario.
yeah,
Why is a professional not in that role as executive chairman? So I would imagine that people are putting this money up will want that to change very quickly. They'll want their own people there. They'll want expertise there, and um, they will take over certainly the strategic running of the club, which has been lacking. But at the same time, and we talked about this when we last spoke about 7 weeks ago. I think there's people that have been unfairly castigated who are good operators, and I put the chief executive among them.
yeah. I mean,
Operation, operationally, Everton, the day-to-day running of the club and so on. I mean, they're okay.
yeah,
But the fact that she's Denise Barrett Baxendale, who I've got an awful lot of time and respect for, the fact that she's on the board, sort of supervising her own role, has made her a target.
yeah, and then, like you said before, it's sort of guilty by association, isn't it? By many people who don't look too deeply into this. I just want to go back to the investment, which am I right in saying this would be an initial, for want of a better term, fee, an initial amount that they put into the football club, which will get them a certain percentage of it. Um, would that entitle them to a position on the board? Would that mean that Mashiri still ultimately decides if an investor can have a position on the board? How would that work?
Yeah, you would expect that they would insist on representation, level of oversight, certain covenants and things to be put in place. I think you would take that for granted, but then you never know. you, you, again, you look, Mr. Bashiri's been there for more than 7 years, and he doesn't actually have his own representative on the board, which is totally extraordinary.
Yeah, and um, I know I mentioned again period of time. I'm sorry to resurface that again, but a certain percentage that they put in initially, does that process, I would imagine, doesn't get kicked down the road as often as you would think. Again, I'm referring to what many Blues have asked. Would there be a position where they can really, really get involved with the club after they've sort of got initially in there?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I think they will ask for certain things in return, and they'll want to protect their investment, which will almost certainly involve bringing their own people in. And you know, you'd expect that to happen sooner rather than later, but
Yeah.
equally, you'd also expect certain things to be off limits. So, for instance, the new stadium director, Colin Chong, who doesn't actually sit on the board, but they're not going to bring in their own stadium guy from America. Um, it's not going to be a complete clean sweep, but you'd expect there to be some changes, if not pretty big changes.
And then finally, when well, obviously we'll find out on Sunday night what's going to happen. Would that change? Obviously, would change things, but to what extent would it change things if Everton are no longer a Premier League side?
it's the doomsday scenario.
Yeah.
I think they'd be all right for the first year. The problems arise because you get half your Premier League broadcast money anyway in terms of parachute payment. So they would then presumably have to sell some of the crown jewels or some of the few remaining crown jewels, Pickford, Onana, maybe Calvert-Lewin, to make up that shortfall. And I think they'd be all right so long as they came straight back up and rebuilt. The
How would
problem
the
is when
investment associated to that though? Do you still think it would go through? Would it happen? Would it be a lower cost for them to come in? Would Mashiri want an instant change because he'd be obviously losing finance that he put into the club over the years?
I don't know. I mean, it's all speculation, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
I I would think if I was an investor or a predatory investor, you'd sort of be waiting on the sidelines open for the worst to happen on Sunday and to pick Everton up for 100 million quid less or 150 million quid less or whatever it is. Um, I, I I don't think it'll alter the appetite for investment. I just as I said when we opened up, I think Everton's a great deal because um, you know as these sports franchises, as the Americans like to call them, go, it has the demographics, the history, the prestige, and you're going to get the big hit that comes with the new stadium when it opens and how that changes the club's finances. So if you took a 5 or 6 year view, which is typically what a private equity firm would do, you'd say, okay, Everton have got revenues of £200 million today, but it's not unrealistic that we'll double those within 6, 7 years because broadcast rights are constantly going up, and there is this new stadium and everything it brings, and then they'll sell it on as a profit. And it's a really attractive investment, whether they stay up or go down.